As usual, what I'm going to do is spend the first short period of time going over some of the particular things that have happened in the last month in the economics of the world, and then focus on the major topics which were listed on the invitation and announcement many of you got. So let's jump right in. I had to begin with a story that appeared a few days ago in the New York Times about something called Zingerman. How many of you caught the story about the Zingerman Enterprises? Oh, good. Just a few. Well, it's in the New York Times, literally 2 or 3 days ago, and I was struck. It's a story of a business, and the business is called Zingerman Enterprises. It started not that many years ago in Madison, Wisconsin, as a tiny little hole-in-the-wall sandwich shop. By the way, if at the end of the program any of you are interested, this is the New York Times, so you can come see it. It's from July 6th is when this appeared. And just to give you an idea, the remarkable thing about the Zingerman Enterprises is that lots of the decisions in this little enterprise are made together by the workers who are all involved. In other words, they've broken down not all of the hierarchy of a normal business. They still have partners who are kind of at the top and everybody else. But the degree of involving their workers in their major decisions, when to expand their businesses, when to move their businesses, and so on, they have invited the workers to participate in a way that is extremely unusual, almost as unusual as the New York Times writing about it. And what struck me was just a few statistics. Let me give this to you. The two gentlemen who started it with Zingerman's Delicatessen, a tiny sandwich, I'm just reading from the Times, a tiny sandwich shop near the university. It has since grown. It is now 9 distinct businesses coordinated. 3 decades it took, 30 years, to go from a tiny sandwich shop with 2 guys to a set of 9 businesses with 650 employees and a combined annual sales of $50 million. Now, what I want to stress to you is this has been a time in which small business, these last 30 years, small businesses have had a very difficult time. Many have not survived. The competition among them and the competition from big businesses honing in on their activity has been devastating. It is a stunning reality that a kind of business organization that massively opens itself to worker involvement should have been so successful in such an otherwise difficult time. And it drives home the point that when you compare the competitive success of traditional businesses, top-down, hierarchical, boss-employee types of businesses, with things that are at least moving in the direction of a cooperative, collective enterprise, you can have a success story on a scale like Zingerman's Delicatessen. In other words, this is an effective, successful challenge to a capitalist way of doing business. This may come as a surprise to you, is not the point that this article makes, but it is the point I wanted to make, and you can get all the details about Zingerman's in the New York Times. Second, since we last met, 2 countries have taken steps either to establish or to raise their minimum wage, and I wanted to make sure you all knew about it. First, Germany. Germany has not had a minimum wage law. Germany's economy is very well organized. It's Germany, after all. And they organize it in such a way that the employers, who are very well organized, sit down with the unions that are very well organized, and they work out a deal that covers everybody. And they don't need the government, and that's basically why they've never had a minimum wage law. But there's been a lot of agitation, and so they finally passed a minimum wage law which went into effect since our last monthly meeting. So I wanted you to know that their minimum wage that they established to start off is about $11.30 an hour. Ours is $7.35 an hour. Let me do that again. Germany is 11 and a quarter, United States a little over $7. Our president has announced that he's in favor of a $10.10 an hour minimum wage, but apparently will not be able to get that through the Congress. So the Germans have 11 and a quarter. Second interesting thing that happened was the British government raised, they have a minimum wage, they raised their minimum wage, another block this last month. So they're now also at about $11.50 an hour, like the Germans, and way ahead of us. Denmark also has a minimum wage. That's $20.30 an hour. And let me say that again. Denmark has a minimum wage of $20.30 an hour. The Swiss, who have decided not to be what they once were, which is kind of asleep, but to actually, and I should be careful, I have French and Swiss relatives, so I don't mean to be nasty about the Swiss, but nonetheless, they have a democratic system that allows people to sign petitions, and then the items are put on the ballot. It's very easy in Switzerland to have something be voted on by the entire Swiss population. So they recently had a ballot initiative. They got more than the, I think it's 100,000, whatever the number is that they needed to sign it, and that was to establish a minimum wage of $25 an hour. That effort was voted down, but not by a lot. So they're going to continue the agitation. So let's review. Switzerland is struggling for 25. Denmark already has more than 20. Britain has over $11 an hour, and Germany does. And we come roaring in with $7.35. What is that? Think about it. What do you think it says about an economy, a society, that I could give you such numbers? Okay, I'm leaving it. You can draw the conclusions yourself and what it might mean. We are as rich or richer than all of those societies, but we just do not treat our people that way. Last thing. Is it true, as conservatives like to repeat forever, that if you raise the minimum wage, there will be some workers who will lose their jobs because the employer now has to give them $10 an hour instead of $7.35 or $7.65, whatever it is? The answer is unambiguously yes. There will be some employers, from everything we can tell, who, if they have to pay workers higher, anything higher, won't do it. But that's not the end of the story. To say that that's going to happen is a little bit like saying, will there be, over the next 12 months, rain? Yes, there will be rain. Does that mean we're going to be flooded out? Does that mean we shouldn't have picnics scheduled outside? No, it means there's going to be rain. There will be some people who lose their job if you raise the minimum wage. But what are the other consequences of the minimum wage? Well, if you raise the minimum wage for millions of workers, and remember, the minimum wage raising doesn't just affect the people who are at the minimum wage. Doesn't just mean that a person at $7.35 will go to 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever it is. Many other workers who get a bit more than the minimum wage have a wage that is determined in relationship to the minimum. In other words, they're given $1 more than the minimum, or $1.50, for all kinds of reasons. All of those people will see their wages go up. That means, and we have rough estimates of this, that somewhere on the order of 8 to 12 million Americans, minimum, will have their wages go up. When those people's wages go up, they will, this is going to come as rocket science to some, they're going to spend that money being poor people. which means a lot more stuff is going to be sold to them because they've got more money to buy it. And if they buy more stuff, you're going to have to, get ready, hire people to make the extra stuff that they're buying, which is going to create jobs. So does raising the minimum wage make people better off by the millions? Yes. Will it create jobs? Yes. Will they be more or less than the jobs lost? We don't know, but probably more. Meanwhile, even if it nets out, an awful lot of people are going to have a higher standard of living. That's the reality. The rest is a silly debate in which you take one side of a complex issue, hammer at that one in the hopes that people don't understand. You're just looking at one aspect of something. You're not looking at the totality when the thing looks really quite different. Don't be fooled. Our next topic is the same issue, looking at it all, although some of you may disagree with me a little bit about this one. There's a fight going on in New York City, but in a number of other cities around the world. On the one hand is the hotel and hospitality industry. On the other hand is something called Airbnb. You all know what Airbnb, and there are others like it, but it's basically a computerized service that allows anyone who has an apartment, more or less, to sort of rent it out to people who are visiting in your city, wherever you are. And here in New Yorkers being the way they are, they've jumped into that with gusto. And so there are many thousands of people coming to New York, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, who are not going to hotels anymore because they're staying at the apartment of Frank and Mary, because Frank and Mary can go stay with friends and they can make a nice bundle over the weekend by renting out their apartment wherever it is, because people will save a fortune compared to what you have to pay for a hotel room in New York. And Airbnb, some of you must have noticed it, has posters in the subway telling everybody what a wonderful thing this is and how great we can all now share our housing and all of this other stuff. And the hotels are screaming bloody murder because hurting their business. Now, this is clearly understandable. You got two businesses that are fighting. Airbnb makes a fortune by charging, those of you who've ever used it, a fee, a modest fee, for connecting you, if you're looking for a place, with a person who has a place looking for someone to rent it. So Airbnb is a business making a lot of money by being the broker, if you like. The hotels, you know what their business is, they want you to come to the hotel. Each side is suggesting the following: that there's some reason why you, the public, you and I, should be on their side. The hotels are trying to use their power to create laws here in New York and other states to basically make it impossible for this to go on. They want to shut Airbnb down. They don't want the competition. They don't want to lose all those people staying at hotels. Airbnb does not want to be destroyed as a business, so they're fighting back. Okay? This happens all the time. Businesses are constantly in trouble. They face competition, either from others who do the same thing, or in this case, a little new way of doing something, and then they scream bloody murder. But always remember, this is a fight between two capitalists, or two capitalist industries. Don't get caught up in the PR. Now, let me explain what that means. There will be winners and losers, whichever way it goes. And the winners and losers include all of you. So be careful before you jump and fall for the propaganda of either side here. So let's look at the hotels. We employ poor people. This leaves out the fact that the reason the people are poor is that the hotels don't pay them anything. What's really remarkable, the PR, it's like we've done a favor to poor people by hiring them, rather than we're proud we've kept these people really poor by paying them nothing. Okay? That's very bizarre. But it's true, technically, that the people who work for hotels are so poorly paid, they certainly qualify by and large as poor. They're mostly non-white, they're mostly poor, the usual story. Okay? So they've converted the fact that they're a low-wage industry into an action as if they're, but you know, it has its grain of truth. Because if you hurt the hotel industry, they're going to lay off those people. Of course they are. Which is going to make them poorer still. You got to deal with it. That's the way it is. Wow. On the other hand, it's true that a young couple just starting out, no kids yet, just struggling in New York with the prices what they are. Wow, it's nice every month, one weekend maybe you can stay with friends or visit your parents and rent the place out and get $200-300. Wow, that'll make finances for that month a bunch better. Don't we want to help people in that situation? Don't we want to save money for people who want to come and visit New York and look at this Empire State Building and all the rest, and they wouldn't afford it if they had to pay a hotel, but now they can come and stay with you, or at least in your apartment. Isn't that a good thing? Sure, it's a good thing. But now remember, if you stay at an Airbnb, deal with a person, and you pay them a couple $100, they don't pay taxes. The hotel pays taxes, which means that the revenue coming into the city from Airbnb is lower than the revenue coming to the city if you go to a hotel. And that's going to have problems for the hotel, isn't it? And that's going to have problems for the city, which is now going to be losing revenue, a city that's already in trouble. So when you begin, and we've just scratched the surface, you begin to look at all the consequences here. The notion that you ought to clearly favor X than Y is almost always a mistake. What's happening is you're being hustled by people in a fight to line up with one or the other, by each of them telling you a story they hope you will find appealing, and you won't do the work of inquiring, and you won't encounter somebody to tell you what the other dimensions of this struggle are. It's not us who are going to be served by the outcome. Both sides are looking to gain an advantage, and they'll both figure out ways, probably, to screw the public, since that's part of what the business is. If Airbnb triumphs, to imagine, if they become successful and powerful, that the fees they charge for doing this won't go up, nobody in this room should be that naive. And if the hotels triumph, that they won't take advantage of their situation, of course they will. And it won't be to help their employees, it'll be to make more money. But keep it in mind before you are fooled into thinking this is a struggle between good and evil. This is a struggle between two capitalist enterprises trying to maximize profits and doing it the best way they know how. Okay. Third thing. Reports over the last month have been more than usual about automation. The Oxford University study was the most important, released about 3 weeks ago, which has a headline-grabbing estimate. 47%, this report said, 40% of the jobs that currently exist in the world will be automated out of existence within 30 or 40 years. In other words, we already have the technology that is going to make these jobs done by a machine. And then the usual alarms go up. Oh my goodness, there are no jobs. Everybody's already worried about that. Here's another reason to be worried. It's not just that there are no good jobs, there are no jobs at all. You're going to be replaced by a machine. Now, the first thing to keep in your mind when you read these things is that reports about the imminent disappearance of jobs by automation are as old as capitalism. Hundreds of years old. And they've always been more or less true. 47% of the jobs in 1850 were automated out of existence by 1900. 47% of the jobs in 1900 were automated out of existence by 1950, and so on. The problem is the very process of automation also creates jobs. And you always, again, have to weigh, does that mean that there'll be enough created to replace? No guarantee. We don't have a system that works that out. We could, but we don't. We count on capitalists to make investments, which they may do or they may not do, which they may do in this country or somewhere else. But there's nothing here for you to freak out about. This is the way capitalism works. Capitalism is a system that wants to produce and create the demand so it can keep producing. For a capitalist, everything is about selling whatever it is he or she produces, right? They've got to get it sold. If it can't sell it, they are finished. So the trick is get it sold. This is not a rational decision. So for example, you all know, or you should, that in our society now, we have a computer industry that develops all the time another computer that has a bell or a whistle that's a little new and different, and then a great effort is made to have you believe that if you still work with a computer that is 18 months old, then you and the computer are dinosaurs. You are behind the 8 ball, you are slow, you are in bad shape and should be ashamed of yourself. And your only redemption is to go out and what is the solution? That should give you the first clue. I'm being told something whose endpoint is I go out and spend money, and guess what? Spend money on the people who paid for the message to get you to spend the money. They're not stupid, but we may be. So we behave like that. We heave out all the stuff we've already bought to make room for buying more stuff. We're driven that way. We don't have an economy that treats us to this because we're peculiar. We're peculiar because we've adapted to an economy that works this way. And the peculiarity that we behave this way should be a clue to a critical approach to the way this economic system works. Next point about this automation. Let's suppose it were true. Let's suppose that we have a new technology that means we can produce just as much as we did before, but we need 10% fewer people. Because really that's what automation is. We don't need as many people to produce whatever goods we have. So when we make a technical advance like that, we always have two options, right? Just think with me very simply. We could have the same number of people working, and with new productivity, with more advanced technology, we could produce 10% more stuff. So that's one option. Everybody works just like they did before, and we get 10% more stuff. Second option, we decide we don't want 10% more stuff. We don't even need 10% more stuff. Maybe we're environmentalists and think it's not even good to produce 10% more stuff because we have to denude the planet of resources. So we could then say, let's keep the output the same, we're okay, and everybody will do 10% less work. Because if you're 10% more productive, then there's 10% less work we need to do to get the same output. A rational society would be constantly making the decision, how do we want to use our technical advance? Do we want to do the same work and have more stuff? Or have the same amount of stuff and do less work? In other words, what do we want more? Leisure, free time, or more stuff? A rational society would see that that's the issue and work out a way to make that decision. We don't. Capitalism cannot do that because capitalism cannot accommodate the let everybody do less work. Because if we're going to produce the same stuff and we're going to get it sold, then everybody has to have just as much money as they did before. So let's see. We're going to produce the same stuff, 10% less work, but everybody has to be able to afford it. So we're going to have to pay everybody the same for 10% less work. At which point capitalists begin pulling hair out. They will understand what I just said. If we decide to take the productivity game, the automation, and do less work for the same stuff and enable the people to buy all that stuff, everybody's going to have to get paid just what they did before, but for 10% less effort. 10% less, that's half of a day. Everybody goes home at noon on Friday. Yay. Every Friday. And your salary is the same. At that point, capitalism is like a flower from which water has been withdrawn. It just goes, bleh, is done. So if you're wondering, why are we not rational? Why don't we, past, present, and future, have some sort of democratic public process in which we say thank you to all of those who have improved our technology. Every worker who's figured out a new way to do something. So that takes a little less labor than it used to, because you arrange things this way, because you use that tool in a different way, you develop a new tool, whatever it is. That we would continuously have to decide, okay, now, how are we going to enjoy it? And if you understand that technical breakthroughs are always the product of millions of people, 100 influences on the inventor that enabled that inventor at that moment to make that breakthrough. The idea that all the benefits of the breakthrough should go to the one who did it is really crazy. Why isn't it going to his or her teacher? Why isn't it going to his or her wife? Why isn't it going to his or her minister? Why isn't it going to his or her best friend? All of whom participated in 1,000 ways that they're not even conscious of in enabling that breakthrough. Breakthroughs are always a social process. Good, so let's have a social decision on how we use it. Capitalism not only makes that never happen, but capitalism prevents people from even seeing what I just said. Not even seeing what it is they're losing out on. And the worst thing of all, those of you who are excited about environmentalism, which I'm glad you are, but in a way, environmentalism should have helped you see this the most. Because environmentalism teaches that not only have we never had the chance to take the advantage of automation so we work less, just a footnote. Most of you and most Americans are working more hours now than you ever did. And that's after 200 years in which every technical breakthrough was celebrated because it saved on human labor, just not yours. What kind of a system is this? It's like a perversion of the technical breakthrough. In a sense, capitalism provokes companies to make breakthroughs because they can make money. It's kind of perverse. It stimulates technical breakthrough, it is. But it just can't enjoy it. It's a compulsive, it's a person who compulsively does things I won't discuss because it's dangerous, but don't ever enjoy that activity. They just have to do it. It's a kind of a technical Don Juanism, if you think about it. Okay, I won't go further there. Let me turn now to some of the larger topics that I wanted to go over with you that came in the last month. The first one, and I'm sorry I keep returning to this, but the way the media work, I really don't have any choice. If I'm going to be a consistent presenter to people like you and to the audience, I should mention that we are being recorded, audio and video, and that this will be very widely distributed. This one and all of them actually will be. The Russell Sage Foundation, a very interesting, been around a long time, research outfit. Did a wonderful piece of research which got almost no attention. It's called Wealth Levels, Wealth Inequality, and the Great Recession. And here's what these authors did. I believe they are all professors of economics at, I don't know. The article from which this is taken was published in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, et cetera, et cetera. They're professors at some big university. I just don't have it in my notes here. Anyone who's interested, you can come up and see it. It's easily available on the internet. You can get copies of it. Here's what they did. They asked a simple question. Let's look at American households and let's examine their wealth. How have they been doing? And they looked both from 1984 to the present and particularly over the last 10 years, from 2003 to 2013. An interesting choice because 2003 is before this big crisis hits in 2007, and then the last 6 years is the crisis. And they ask the question, what happened to the wealth of American households? And by wealth, they mean kind of everything that one looks at for wealth. Your home, because if most Americans, if they have any wealth at all, their house or their home is it. But also if you have a savings account, if you have some stocks and bonds, the usual thing. And they have to take into account your debts too. It's sometimes called net worth, what you have sort of really yours. And the results are, for me, absolutely stunning and go to the question, is there a recovery in the United States? And all of these prices have been adjusted so that we don't have to worry about inflation. We've made them all in the similar prices so we don't have to worry. We get a real sense of the number. So I'm going to give you the basic number. This is the median wealth. That is 50% of Americans had a worse record of wealth and 50% had more. Median is the one in the middle. Not the average, it's the median. 50% of Americans have a sadder story, 50% of Americans have a better one. Okay, just three numbers to keep in your head. In 2003, the median wealth in 2013 dollars, that is in the money as it means, what it means today, and you might find this interesting, the total wealth of the median family household in this country was $88,000. You know, if something happens to you and you have to live on whatever you have, you're not going to live very long if $88,000 is what you have. Half of Americans didn't even have that. This is the median. Half had 88 or less, half had 88 or more. By 2007, when the crisis hit, this had gone up to 98,000, so there had been some improvement. Lest you think that that's because people's wages went up, it didn't. Because in the period from 2003 to 2007, there was a sharp increase in the number of Americans working each household. So what you're watching there is not a growth of wages, but a growth in the number of people and the number of hours those people are spending earning money. 2009, the worst moment of this crisis that we've had since 2007. What happened? And remind you, median was 88,000 in 2003, went up to 98,000 in 2007. In 2009, 70,000. Staggering drop in 2 years. Those were those horrible 2 years as our economy slid quickly into the circular bowl, okay? Now, the period from 2009 to 2013 is what everybody refers to in the mass media as the recovery. The recovery. So, if the median household wealth in 2009 was $70,000, which it was, what happened between then and 2013? Median household wealth in 2013, $56,000. You understand? The wealth of the American home, which again, remember, the home is the biggest single thing American households have, because the number of American households who have significant wealth in any other form is tiny. Most Americans don't have stocks and bonds, or if they have stocks and bonds, the amount of it is trivial, very small. So it's really only a tiny percentage have anything. In other words, over the 4 years of the recovery, the median wealth of the household dropped from 70,000 to 56,000. That's not a recovery. Whatever that is not a recovery. And of course, therefore, what we're doing now is limping along, because what are people going to do if the majority, that's what we're talking, have had a decline in their wealth? They're going to be scared. They're not going to spend money like they used to. They're going to forgo that extra latte because maybe if they do that every day, things will be better. There is no recovery for the mass of the American people. There hasn't been, and there isn't any. Now, in a proper mass media, when you tell a story, like, for example, that the unemployment rate goes from whatever it was down to 6.1%, and everybody was celebrating that a few days ago, that's fine. That has certain meaning. Not quite the meaning they say, but it has to be put alongside of it. You have to be presented with a story where it says, okay, here's some numbers that we would like to believe showing things getting better. Here's some numbers that show something else, and now how do we make sense of it? You don't get that. You get, again, this lopsided story, just like you get a lopsided story about Airbnb versus the hotels, or a lopsided story about minimum wage up and down and what its social effects are. Don't fall for it. The wealth of Americans, for the mass of Americans, continues to shrink. It continues to shrink. Across this whole recovery, it continues to shrink. And if you're wondering why Americans are upset, whether the upset takes the form of going to a Tea Party meeting, or the upset takes the form of 100 other forms, the underlying reality, whether people are upset to the right, to the left, whether they've decided that the biggest problem is those immigrants coming in, or wherever their upset goes, don't forget what at least one of the basic goads to their upset and anxiety is. Their economic situation is bad and deteriorating. And their economic prospects are bad and deteriorating. Okay. Next item. For some reason, I'm concentrating on the New York Times. I don't really know why, but I will. 3 days ago, on the 7th of July, a front-page story in the New York Times. You might have noticed it because it was a bit arresting that they would be like this. They don't usually do this. It said, asset prices are going crazy around the world, and they used the word boom, and then a comma, or maybe a bubble. That was the way the headline was written. Wow, bravo, somebody's gotten a job by mistake over there. So you read this front page article, and what does the article say? People are getting worried. What people? Financial bigwigs, especially, getting worried. Asset prices are going through the roof. I'll give you an example. Real estate prices in London went up 25% over the last year. Whoa. And in all of England, 12, 15%. That's a lot. That's a lot. Big office buildings in New York City are going for wild amounts of money. Rupert Murdoch bought an apartment over there on Madison Park, 23rd and Madison, there by that little park where you get the expensive hamburgers. Hamburgers again. So he spent, I believe, $40 million for a triplex apartment. That tall, some of you have seen it, that very tall, thin building that looks over the park there. He has the top floors of it. Prices are going crazy. Prices of artworks are going crazy. What's going on? And the New York Times is worried. And the financial world that they report is worried. The governor of the Bank of England is worried. We're having another explosion of prices, which then bursts when somebody can't pay and then the prices collapse and then people are thrown out of work and then we have it all over again. Worry. What's happening? This is what I want to explain. The article isn't real good about that. So let's go. Let's explain. Over the last 40 years, everywhere in the world, but particularly here in the United States, the gap between rich and poor has become much wider. We've talked about that. You're all familiar with that. You don't need me to go over that. But that has consequences. If more and more wealth is in the hands of a tiny number of people, if more and more of the income that's earned each year is finding its way into the pockets of a small number. And again, just to remind you, in the 1970s and 80s, the average CEO got 40 times what the average worker. Today, it's 200 or 300 times what the average worker gets. So obviously, there's a gap here. If you are interested, you could pick up the current, or I think it's dated July 21st, the current issue of Forbes magazine, which is very proud because this issue is devoted to the richest families in America. And there you will see a lovely group portrait of the Walton family. I believe it's about a dozen people whose combined worth is over $150 billion. I mean, it does boggle the mind. 150. So all of that wealth is, well, you know, if you have $150 billion, think with me a minute. What are you going to do? I mean, it means you could spend tens of millions of dollars a day forever. Okay? And even in your wildest fantasies, how many houses are you going to have? One for each day? You can't even get to the, from there to here. So if you have enough wealth, you stop having anything you can do with it. What are you going to buy? Legislation. So, well, yeah, sure. You bribe some people, that'd be fun. Might be nice to be the mayor of New York. Might be fun to be a senator. No, that's what, but that doesn't take a large, $10, $20 million. If you're a billionaire, what's that? You can be, it's really fun, you can be the kind of person to whom the candidates for president come whenever you want them, because you write checks. What's his name? Foster Fleiss, who bankrolled Santorum. Sheldon Adelson, who bankrolled the crazy one from Georgia. Gingrich, sorry. I shouldn't pick him out. He's no crazier than the other ones. Fine. But they wouldn't have been in the news if they didn't have the money that comes from one or another of these people for whom $10 million is the equivalent of your dropping a quarter out of your pants. Well, the only way those people have all that money is if masses of people don't have it. This is not rocket science. See, if you distributed the wealth to everybody, everybody would then not have all that much, and they would spend it, because that's what people who don't have that much do with it. You probably noticed that in your own life. Your problem is not what do I do with it, your problem is I never have enough. It's a very different problem. So you wouldn't have the economy working the way it does now if the wealth were spread, if the income were distributed much more equally. This is not a moral question. It's just the mechanics of how things work. So if over 40 years you've removed income and wealth from the mass of people, the way my statistics of 5 minutes ago demonstrate, and you concentrate it in the hands of a tiny number, you're going to screw up the demand for goods and services. You're just gonna. Because yes, the demand for Lear jets will go up, but that will be more than offset by the fact that most people can't replace their sofa. And they can't get a car, and they can't do the other things that they used to be able to do every 2 years. Now there's going to be every 5 years. You get the picture. We've been doing that. And when the crisis hit in 2007 and 2008, it was even worse. So the government got frightened. even big business got frightened. The economy looked terrible. Those last 4 months of 2008, people in the highest levels of the American government were really anxious that the whole thing was going to stop. So they brought the government in a big way. Leftists didn't bring the government in. Socialists didn't bring the government in. Labor unions didn't bring. The bankers rushed to Washington, save us. And they did. They came in. And mostly what they did, you know the story is, and keep this in mind, pump oodles of money into the economy. They literally, the Federal Reserve, as you presumably know, can make money. It just does that. Either prints, well, that's what it does. It prints money or it credits banks' accounts, so the banks have more money. And the idea was a very old idea in economics. We'll get the economy going again by flooding the banks with money and saying to them now, take all this money that we give to you virtually costless, here it is, and go lend it out. Lend it out to people who will then spend it, and lend it out to businesses who will then invest it. And then we'll get people buying goods and services, and companies making things, and hiring people, and we'll get out of this awful economic downturn. That's what the plan was. It worked so far. They increased the quantity of money in the last few years like we never had before in American history. Wild increases in the quantity of money. Banks flush with money. But that part worked, but the next part didn't. First, they didn't lend it to people. Why not? Because Americans, the American don't take this personally, the American working class isn't safe to lend to anymore. Because the crisis began when those deadbeats couldn't pay back their mortgages. Don't you remember? So if we got into trouble as banks lending to Americans who can't pay back, we're sure as hell not going to do that again. Thank you very much for the money, but we're not lending it to the American people because they're over their heads in debt already. Number one. Number two, and we're not lending it to most businesses either. And you know why? A, we don't believe there's people out there going to buy what they can't sell what they're producing now. That's why they've been laying people off. We're not going to lend to them to produce more. Who's going to buy it? And you know what the banks tell us? That's not a problem because the big businesses, they don't want to borrow money anyway because they know they can't sell it. So we're not lending it to people and we're not lending it to businesses. Okay, makes perfect sense. But if you don't lend it to people, you don't lend it to business, you don't have a recovery, do you? Well, what do those banks do with the money? What do? Because the banks, you know, they've got to lend it out because that's how they make money. They got that money that the government gives them, if it sits in their vault, useless. Not making them any money. And they actually have to pay a little bit to the Federal Reserve when they get that money. So they have to go lend it out, otherwise they're actually losing money. So they've got to lend. We got it. We're going to lend it to two things. First, we've got to lend it to the United States government. You know why? Because the United States government is spending more money than it's taking in taxes, and it needs the Treasury to borrow money. And normally we wouldn't like to lend to the government, but this is really great. The Federal Reserve gives us money and charges us about 0.5% a year, which is what the Federal Reserve charges. And then we turn around and we lend it to the Treasury of the United States, which pays us between 2 and 3% for the exact same money. Let me do that again for those of you that didn't get it. And it's important that you understand this because This is an opportunity you don't have, and nor will you ever get it. But it also helps you to understand why banks, to steal an old folk song, are made of marble. The Federal Reserve prints money and lends it to the banks at 0.5% a year. How much? Billions and billions. And the banks say thank you and take the money and lend it to the United States Treasury, which pays them 2 to 3% for the money. How much? Hundreds of billions. Do you understand? Absolutely riskless subsidy to the biggest banks in the world. And on behalf of all of them, as I find myself doing so often, on behalf of all of those banks, to all of you, thank you. Very kind of you. And especially considering that our behavior dunked you into a stupefying crisis of the last 7 years, that you would be so understanding as to subsidize your way out of it by giving us all that money. This is the greatest country on earth. Nobody in their right mind would do this. But we aren't, so we do. What was the other thing they did? They began to lend money to people who had an idea of what would happen when there's all this money accumulating in banks that they can't lend to the people, too dangerous, and they don't lend to the businesses because they don't want it. These are people who said, I know what's going to happen. When you got all this money that has to be lent at an interest rate, and it can't be lent into the economy to make jobs and production, it's going to be used for speculation. And the first ones on this game are the winners. They borrowed $1 billion and they bought shares of what? Who cares? Because everyone's going to do that. And so if you're in it early, you'll buy them for $20 a share, and the next one who borrows from the next bank will buy them from you for 23, and then they'll sell them for 26, and then the last 5 years have been a rise in the stock market just like that. Are the companies producing more? No. No. They're just sitting there, just like real estate. They're sitting there and the price keeps going up because everybody can get all the money they want from the bank to buy it, and the rationale is, I can sell it for more to a person who also borrowed. And so it goes until it blows. That's the history of every speculative bubble in the last 300 years. And we're in another one. There really is no mystery here. This is a dysfunctional economic system. This is capitalism behaving in a way that I can describe to you this way, and you can enjoy with me laughing at it, which is good, it's healthy. Just as long as we all remember we're laughing at something that has got its hand in our wallets all day, every day. Very, very serious. We are in a bubble. We are in no recovery at all for the mass of people. We are living out an economic system that doesn't work for us anymore. Whatever you think of the history of capitalism, it's not working now. And that ties me in to something I have said to you before, but I have to do it again briefly. What's happening? Well, what's happening is the capitalism as a system is really moving on, and it's leaving us behind. Capitalism, 200 or 300 years old, that's all. Starts in England, the 18th century, spreads to Europe, Western Europe, and then to the United States and Japan. And those are the great centers of capitalism for the last 250 years. Western Europe, North America, Japan. And one of the characteristics of that capitalism was it concentrated its production facilities in its home base, in its lands of origin. So America concentrated its industries here. You know where, you know, Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and New York and all the places. And in England and Leeds and Manchester and Liverpool, blah, blah, blah. In Lille, in Dusseldorf, we all know where it is, where they were. And they drew people in from the countryside who became urban dwellers to work in the concentrated industry. And eventually capitalism was so successful that it ran out of sufficient food, raw materials, and workers in its own country. So it had to globalize. So the Europeans, the North Americans, and the Japanese carved up the rest of the world to be the source of their food, their raw materials, and their workers. That's why so many people from the third world have found their way into the centers of capitalism. Of course. These are people who were either forced or chose not to live in the places that were the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, right? The people in the third world whose only function was to provide food, raw materials, and people to the center. They wanted a better life in the center, which is where the better life was. Understood. So successful was this capitalism that when the workers began to fight in the urban areas of old capitalism, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, the capitalists were willing to make a deal. They didn't want to, they fought it, but they were beaten. Unions developed, socialists developed, communists developed, and the wages went up. And that was okay. The capitalists, we'll give you a modest wage increase if we have to, because we're making so much money on the rest of the world, we can afford it. So over time, now gets us up to 1970s, what do we have? Lousy wages, horrible conditions in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the place where the food, raw materials, stuff comes from, and nice wages here in Canada, in Western Europe, in Japan. Nobody misunderstood that. The poor in the third world, they knew exactly what they were living, and they could see on television what it was like. And so they came, those who could. Always a wrenching experience, obviously, to be an immigrant, to leave your home, to leave your family, to leave your community, leave your language, all the rest. But then in the 1970s, something happened that changed everything. Two things, really. Jet travel. The ability to move around the globe in a matter of hours, which you really couldn't do before. And second, the internet, telecommunications. It meant that a factory didn't have to be anymore in Western Europe, North America, or Japan. You could locate it somewhere else because you could get there quickly, and with telecommunications, you could literally see and monitor everything that went on in that factory. Before, in order to do that, it had to be down the road from you. Now it doesn't. And all capitalists understood within a matter of months that the world had changed. Why, and here comes a punchline, why the hell should a capitalist stay in Western Europe, North America, or Japan, paying the wages that had gone up for 200 years, when they could move production to Asia, Africa, Latin America, even Eastern Europe, where the wages hadn't gone up for 200 years, they had in fact gone down. What money could be made if you moved the factory out of Liverpool into Shanghai, out of Detroit into Sao Paulo? Wow. My goodness. Capitalism, which had driven down the wages in the rest of the world, would now be able to take advantage of what it had done. It could kiss goodbye the highly paid workers of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. See you later. We're out of here. We're out of here. capitalism leaving town, going elsewhere. That's why all of you right now are wearing Chinese clothing. That's why all of you are toasting, making your toast in the morning in a Chinese toaster and watching a tiny Chinese television and flicking on your Chinese iPad, etc., etc. And if it isn't China, okay, it's India or Indonesia, or you get the picture. Which means what? It means that in the last 40 years, all of the excluded of the world, the mass of the working class in Asia, Africa, Latin America, that had no function other than to stay out there in the bush, stay out there in the rural areas, grow the coffee that we will drink, pull up the mining, the metals from the ground, but otherwise, don't talk to us. Live in a shack. Suddenly, no, we need you. Come, we're setting up a factory right down the dusty road from where you live, in China, in Africa, in Asia, and everywhere. Now we have something for you to do. We have a place for you. But what does that mean? It means you're taking hundreds of millions, literally billions of people that were outside of the capitalist economy and bringing them in. And when you do that, you are creating a spectacular competition between the newly arrived cheap workers and the old traditional highly paid workers of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And that's a no contest. That drives down the average level of wages everywhere. And so we have the abandonment of capitalism, saying goodbye to its countries of origin. See you later. I'm out of here. And you, and when I point to you, I mean you in North America, and you in Western Europe, and you in Japan, you are now finally going to learn what it can be like to be on the wrong end of capitalism. Whereas those of you working in China and India are going to discover rising wages. Of course, much lower than what we have in the West, because the West ones are coming down, but the ones in the poor part of the world still have a long way to go to get up. Meanwhile, the capitalists are giggling all the way to the bank, because for them, the extra supply of laborers that they can choose among allows them to pay everybody less than they used to have to pay. That's why the stock market is, of course, booming. That's why profits are wild. That's why the leading CEOs can give themselves amounts of money they never dreamed of before. That's why the imbalance between the rich and the poor has gone crazy. That's why Detroit is a bombed-out, empty city, and Cleveland, and Camden, and all of the others, and Lille, and so forth. That's why this policy didn't work. No one's going to lend money to produce. For whom? The well-paid workers are losing out on everything here in the West, and the ones that are replacing them still don't have enough money to be able to buy anything anyway. So there's no production. There's just a kind of hysterical, speculative frenzy that will, of course, blow itself up. And I make that prediction only because that's what happened every other time in the history of capitalism. May not happen this time, who knows? But if history is any guide, oh boy, are we in for a doozy. And when? Soon. Soon. Hard to see that this continues very much longer. I'm sorry if some of this occasionally operates as less than a boost to your morale. On the other hand, I do believe that there is a pleasure in understanding things. And so that's the offset. Plus, those of you that are contemplating a life of activism, whatever your age, you need to understand what's going on if your activism is going to work, if it's going to grow. And so you need to know. And there's a lot of movement building that can come out of this being understood by people that are actually living through it and who are very nervous for good reasons as to what their children are going to have as their opportunities or not in this system. All right, in the time that remains, as all of this is going on, corporate America is doing what one does in this situation. You are stuck in the United States. Why? Because that's where you were born as a nation, as a corporation. That's how you grew. That's who your workers mostly are. That's who your shareholders mostly are. That's who your corporate executives mostly are. You're an American company. But you know, even if you don't say it to yourself, that you're in a place that's going down. What do you do? What do the famous beasts on ships do when they begin to think it's going down? They get off. And let's see how that's being done. Two major ways. One, it's called the use of offshore tax havens. Here's a wonderful report, also done over the last month since we were here, called Offshore Shell Games, the use of offshore tax havens by Fortune 500 companies. Very interesting report, also available on the internet. You can get anywhere you want. Here's what they've done. Using the official documents issued by the Fortune 500 companies, these folks found the following, and I'm just going to give you the summary. I looked at all of the Fortune 500. That refers to the Fortune magazine that keeps a record of the 500 most important, biggest corporations in America. That's what the Fortune 500 is. Here's what they found out. Out of the Fortune 500, 362 companies, that's 72% of them, operate subsidiaries in tax haven jurisdictions outside the United States in 2013. So 3/4 of the biggest corporations in America have these subsidiaries. 64% of these, that is 2/3 of them, have them in at least one of their subsidiaries in either Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. With all due respect to Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, you do not have a subsidiary in the Bermuda or the Cayman Island in order to produce anything, because those places don't produce anything and never have, other than tomatoes and pineapples and tourist activity. Other than that, they run out of things to do in those places. There are approximately 5,000 or 6,000 subsidiaries of American corporations located in these two sunny places. What are they doing there? Are they producing something? No, never have. Are they shipping something? No, never have. Are they receiving anything? No, never have. What are they doing? The answer is they're being there. They have an office. Well, actually, that's not accurate. They all pay a lawyer, a Bermudan or a Cayman Island lawyer. He or she has an office, and in the office are mailboxes, thousands of them. In fact, that's all there is in the office, a mailbox. And the mailman comes in with letters and puts them in the mailbox. By establishing a subsidiary there, a corporation in New York or Chicago routes its activities through that place. For example, a hypothetical, of course, a company in Cleveland produces something. Let's say it sells that to the public for $1,000. And it would normally make a profit of $200. Cost it $800, sells it $1,000. It would make a $200 profit, and if it did that in Cleveland, where it's based, it would then have to pay an income tax to the United States and to the state of Ohio on the profits that it earns. That's the way the law works. So here's what they do. they sell the product that cost them $800 to the subsidiary in Bermuda, charging them $800. Let's do that. It cost them $800, and they sold it for $800, so their profit is zilch, nothing. And if you have zilch as your profit, the tax on zilch is zilch. This is high finance mathematics. So they don't have any tax to the United States anymore, do they? Or to Ohio anymore. The subsidiary in Bermuda, having purchased this good for $800 from the parent company, now proceeds to sell it to the American customers for the $1,000, meaning that the subsidiary in Bermuda gets a $200 profit. They bought something for $800, they sold it for $1,000, they made $200, which is good for the parent company because the income tax in Bermuda is zilch. In this manner, the company saves taxes and has a big smile for the accountant and the vice president of financial affairs who figured this complicated thing out. That's it. The United States, therefore, doesn't get any taxes anymore. You understand? The taxes are paid to Bermuda, and even if Bermuda charged 5%, who cares? That's 5% on 200. That's a lot less than the American rate. Official rate, United States federal rate on profits, 35%, plus whatever Ohio charges. So maybe 40% they'd have to. Instead of 40, they pay 5% to Bermuda. Fine. Some of you know that over the last 25 years, a very poor backward corner of Europe has had quite a renaissance. It's the country of Ireland. How did they do that? I just told you. Corporate rate of taxation on profits, 12%. Everybody and his brother closes the factory in the United States and opens it in Ireland. Plays the same game with the subsidiary or actually produces something there. It doesn't matter. The profits show up there, you pay the tax rate there. You understand? Estimate of this report, something on the order of $112 billion a year lost to the American government because companies do this. Now let's be real clear. If companies do this, they do it to escape taxes. They're not going to Bermuda for any other purpose. Nobody in the company ever goes to Bermuda. They have a lawyer. They pay him a few $1,000s a year, and they pay the local post office for the box. That's it. The rest is done by the accountant in their office. The end result, the United States government is out $150 billion, leaving the United States government with two choices. Either you get the money that you can't get from them anymore by taxing you, or, if they don't want to do that, because that's politically unpopular, by cutting expenditures, because they don't get the money from these corporations anymore. So either you have less government services, or you pay more taxes. So once again, on behalf of America's leading corporations, I want to say to all of you, thank you. Very kind of you to permit me to do this. Second way this is done is something called, and I want you to learn the language so you're up to date in finance, it's called an inversion. That's not about bad climate, you know, foggy dust and smog. An inversion is the following. Under American law, if an American company can show that 20% of its shares are owned by nationals of another country, it can declare itself to be a company in that other country and thereby only pay taxes in that other country. Well, right now, there's a rush of American companies who are taking advantage of them. Okay? The latest one, and the one that's in the papers right now that you'll be reading about, is a company you all know, Walgreens, your local drugstore, which I believe now includes Duane Reade as a part of itself. They are in the process of inversion. They are, and it's wonderful how this works, they're going to buy a company in Europe. Not yet clear which country they're going to pick. They're going to buy a company. Here's what they're going to do. They're not going to pay a nickel. They're going to buy the company, ready, with 20%. They're going to print more shares, 20% more. Use that to buy the company in the other country, declaring Walgreens is now an Irish company or a Dutch company or an Austrian company, and therefore pays the tax rates there, which will come as a big surprise to you, are much lower than the tax rate here. Chiquita Banana did that a little earlier this year. So the next time you eat one of those lovely yellow things, be aware that the 2 cents out of what you paid that used to go to Uncle Sam is now going to Uncle somebody else. Someone else. Nothing is done to stop this. This has been going on for as long as anyone can remember. The forms change from time to time. Periodically, a group of politicians will make a wonderful name for themselves by saying, this is an outrage, and I propose to do blah, and then there'll be a fight, and then we'll do blah, and it'll continue in a slightly different form, another 20 years, and another group of politicians will be outraged, but whew, and if you live long enough, you can see the same program over and over. Amazing that the American people permit this. Permit this. By the way, how would you stop it? Oh, that's real hard. You would say to Walgreens, you do that, and Walgreens becomes the American drugstore run by the American government. Have a nice day. You're done. You are evading taxes. And that's a big no-no. Can't do that. You mustn't. You can't. And if you do, we will punish you. But of course, that would be an infringement on their freedom, which it would be. Their freedom to move would be taken away. So you can choose, can't you? Either they're free to move, or you're free not to either pay taxes much higher or to lose lots of government services. It's your freedom or theirs. But if you think it's just a question of freedom for them and that you're not involved in this, you're not getting it. That's again that one-sidedness like Airbnb versus the hotels. Last thing, I only have a little bit of, and I'll make this one very short. Over the last month, since we last met, one more big story. This one has to do with my favorite American company, General Motors. General Motors. I'm going to give you just 2 statistics. The average number of cars sold by General Motors in each of the last 3 years is 9.4 million. A lot of cars. So if you add that up, 3 years, 9.4 million, 28 million cars is the total that they produced and sold. How many cars so far, we're not done, we're only halfway through 2014, how many cars has General Motors recalled because they are at least unsafe, and in the case of those ignitions, as you may know, murderous, they killed people? How many? 27 million. What? Yes, I'm going to do that again. They produced and sold over the last 3 years 28 million cars, and they've recalled 27 million. Hello, this suggests, just obliquely, that they're incompetent, aren't they? You killed people with your car. In the case of the ignitions, if those of you followed it, it is clear now, they've admitted most of what I'm about to say. I don't know exactly all of it, but most of it. They knew as far back as 2002. They couldn't kind of work it all out until 2014, during which time, and then they admitted it after they were outed by various whistleblowers. But during that time, people died because the ignition turns on and off, and then the airbags do or do not deploy. People died. They claim, I think, 13 dead people and many more wounded. The government says it's a much larger number, and that's all being fought out. And now General Motors at first wasn't going to give any money. Now it's going to give any money. Today, by the way, General Motors said it's not going to recall a bunch of trucks that seem to be in a problem, so we may go over the 27 million. But friends, if you're the major car company and you produce 28 million cars in 3 years and you recall 27 million cars, in a rational society, people would say, something is wrong here. The woman, Mary Barra, I believe is her name, who's the chief executive of that company, publicly admitted that our internal mechanisms of control and management were seriously deficient. Okay, let's see. We got a total recall. We've killed a lot of people, and the chief executive says we're deficient. Exactly how much evidence do you think one needs? A rational society would say, if a private enterprise upon which the entire society depends, the automobile is kind of, you know, fundamental to our economy. Everything we buy comes in a vehicle to the store where we buy it. Our food comes that way. We all need vehicles to get to the job, to school, whatever. If a private enterprise is as incompetent and deficient as that, it has forfeited the right to continue. The arguments against publicly owned and operated enterprises claims that they aren't efficient. But in the case of General Motors, efficiency is the least of our problem. They're killing us. Maybe even that's efficient, that's true. But I don't want to stop there. I don't want to stop there. Because General Motors is my favorite company for a completely different reason. In 2008 and 9, General Motors demonstrated yet again what a stunning corporation it is. It went bankrupt. And it turned to the United States government and got, you ready? $50 billion of your money, your tax payments. Every time you drink a beer, you give money to Uncle Sam. Every time you smoke a cigarette, every time you drive a car, and of course, if you earn any income, you pay an income. That's your money. When all the dust settled and the government sold the shares that it got for giving the help to General Motors, the net loss for the United States government was around $11 billion. Let's see. So in a short amount of time, this company achieved two things. It recalled everything it did for being deficient, and it went bankrupt. If I taught a course in modern corporate finance, this would be prima facie case, you're gone. You're gone. You're out. You're finished. We're not running this business. It's unsafe. It's unsafe financially. It's unsafe physically. What kind of a system, a capitalist system like ours, can watch all of this, suffer all of this, and go home and watch the World Cup? What? What's going on? What? No, seriously, folks. What really has to happen? Do you have to go up in flames in a car before it kind of comes home to you that this is amazing. This is amazing. Thank you very much for coming.